We have now reached the closing keynote address, which is titled Navigating the Next Decade of Multiple Disruptions. And to deliver this, we have with us Gaurav Gupta, who is the Global Managing Partner of Dalberg Advisors. Gaurav is a leader in sustainability and impact investing. So, Gaurav, we are really looking forward to hearing from you on navigating the challenges and opportunities for the coming decade.
Thanks for that kind intro and for this opportunity, and for anyone who's, I think, depending on their time zone, staying up so late and gotten to the end of this. So I really enjoyed hearing the call, all the discussions. Is it possible for me to oh, I can share screen. Okay, wonderful. I'm going to just share a few slides because as a consultant, I can't get through a conversation without showing people some slides. But I must just, before I do that, confess that I feel like a real imposter here because listening to all of you and people who are working on the front lines, it's amazing to see the depth of the work that's going on. I'm not a deep expert in what I'm about to present you. I'm more someone who looks across many organizations and tries to recognize patterns. And so what I'm actually going to talk about today is the pattern recognition we have gained over the course of the last few years around what different people are experiencing with climate change and what we're telling them as well. So this is really at that institutional layer of how are people engaging on this climate issue, and what are some commonalities around that, and then also some of the advice that we as an organization, the organization I represent, have been giving, and see if that might actually be useful to many of you who I know are dealing with these issues. So let me just bring up those slides, and yes, do let me know if you're not able to see them. Let's see here. Is that coming through?
Yes, it's working.
Okay. Perfect. I guess I just want to first say, where am I coming from? I'm coming from the fact that I'm not an expert. I've been working on climate change for close to 2 decades, but I still feel like I'm very much skirting over the top of it. But I have 500 colleagues around the world who are on a daily basis working with clients where almost everything sits at the intersection of climate. And what you're about to hear is based on what they're learning. And I think my top line is we're concerned optimists because climate is one of several global disruptions going on at the moment. And I think this is what my talk is really going to be about, which is we've heard a lot about climate change, and it's the biggest challenge that I think the globe is facing. But at the same time, we have major disruptions around automation and artificial intelligence. You'll be hearing more and more about that. We're still going through a post-pandemic recovery. And inequality, ever since we've been talking about it since 1990, has actually gotten worse every year that we have spoken about it. These are actually massive disruptions that are going on at the same time as we have this discussion on climate change, and they intersect. And I will go into that in a second. But it makes for a very challenging time for any organization that is either dealing with social impact, trying to think about how to design programs, or indeed even focusing on one thing, which is climate change, because climate change intersects with everything else. How is inequality, for example, relevant to climate change? Interestingly, all of the big revolutions that you will have heard of have happened when inequality has gotten over 65% in terms of what the top 10% of the population own in terms of wealth, right? Whenever the top 10% own more than 65%, that is one common, it's not the only reason, but it's one common metric around where you get big revolutions. By the way, India crossed that number about 1.5 years or 2 years ago. Globally, that number actually currently sits at 75%. The top 10% of the world own about 75% of the wealth. Interestingly, more than half of that is held just by the top 1%. And there's one small piece of analysis I show people, which is that what is interesting about that is it's not necessarily just coming from the poor. A huge amount of the inequality and what the top 0.1% have been gaining and so forth is actually from what I call their friends, right? Which is the 1% that we all know, right? They're the lawyers, the consultants, the bankers, and so forth. Actually, a lot of the inequality has come out from hollowing out actually the gains of the top 1% and going to the 0.1%. So it's a very unusual pattern, which is leading to a lot of the political instability that is going on at the moment, which then impacts climate change, right? Because you suddenly have a move towards populism. It is harder to take on longer term policy making in this kind of environment where there is such significant inequality. But what's particularly challenging is when these disruptions actually intersect with each other. Um, uh, as an example, AI has so much potential, but we all know that in a capitalist structure, anytime you have a monopoly type structure of assets, which is what AI will be, right? AI rewards the size of data. So it is a winner takes all model. Any of these generative AI models, the bigger they are, the better they will be. And that is why it will be folks like Google and Microsoft that will continue to dominate that space. And we have seen in any of those kind of structures where you have an asset-based structure and winner takes all, economies of scale, inequality actually gets a lot worse. But actually, one of my favorite quotes is from Walter Scheedel. You should definitely read some of his work, who puts it very bluntly that basically you need bloodshed to ever reduce inequality. But I bring that up because that is the fundamental thing that we're floating on, right? We're floating on increasing inequality, trends such as AI and others that point towards that could actually get worse. We saw that in the pandemic, that even health pandemics effectively increase inequality. And now what we're seeing is that health pandemics are worsened more likely as a result of climate change. So again, these things are starting to intersect where things that should have been happening between 100 to 400 years are going to happen twice in people's lifetimes, which is unprecedented. And I think, again, based on what we've just gone through, imagine going through that again in any time over the next 20, 30 years. It could even happen again this decade. There's nothing that says we would not experience another pandemic in a decade because of just how much more statistically probable it has become. And what that means for India is that, we're creating new vulnerable segments. You were used to this idea of talking about intergenerational poverty, gender discrimination, challenges with dependency and access to capital. These are the traditional issues when we talk about whether man-animal conflict or whether we're talking about climate change. It often comes down to these traditional vulnerable populations that most suffer. But actually, we're also creating a whole set of new vulnerable populations. We have a challenge where one of my favorite people, Safina Hussain, who runs Educate Girls, an NGO that works with about 1.5 million girls on a daily basis. She has spent her whole life fighting poverty and patriarchy. And as of last year, she started to say, girls are more likely to miss school now due to climate change than due to patriarchy. So again, you're seeing how climate is intersecting with these other social challenges. Education has been one of the levers that people have been looking towards as a means for increasing equity and reducing inequality. And that itself is currently under attack as a result of climate change. So I only have a little amount of time, so I thought I just wanted to, that is the thesis, which is when we have been speaking to our clients, effectively what has been going on is they are talking about the challenges they face at one or two or three of these intersections. That when they look to the future, we know that underlying everything is the need for sustainability and climate change, but then they're also trying to deal with a world where the jobs that they were working towards, the skills that they were providing are being evaporated because of the way AI is developing, or inequality is meaning that they're not able to drive the kind of policy formation that they need because the policy landscape has suddenly shifted. So with all of this going on, there are about 4 things that when I looked across all of our work over the last several years that were common patterns. These are purposefully reductive. Then there's a lot more depth you can go into on the particulars of each client and what they need. But I wanted to just draw out for you four basic insights. The first is we tell all of our clients to plan to unplan over this coming decade. It is when you have this many global disruptions, and I think it's quite unprecedented. The four that I spoke about are actually being experienced by every human being on the planet. Inequality, climate change, the impacts of AI and automation, and a post-pandemic recovery where this a whole generation of students has missed out on 1 to 2 years of learning is being experienced everywhere at the same time. And that is meaning that behaviors, realities for people have shifted, and these things will keep intersecting. So we are helping clients think about how to actually unplan rather than to plan. This is not the time for you to be thinking about what's my 3-year or 5-year plan. It's how do I build a capability to rapidly prototype ideas rather than focusing on planning. Sorry, I'll just jump through a few of these. The second is that most organizations, and I think many of you, as you will have engaged on a daily basis, have rules of thumbs around your stakeholders, right? You believe women in farming in this kind of area behave a certain way, or people living on the edges of forests dealing with man-animal conflict, as we just heard about from Kritika, will behave in a certain way. And what we're here to tell you is all of that behavior is shifting. People are fundamentally shifting over the course of the last year or two because of what the pandemic has done, because of different pressures that are being experienced, because of climate disasters. And so there's a real need for all of us to reacquaint ourselves with stakeholders, to get much more on the ground, and to take deeper studies of what's really going on. These past ideas are no longer going to work. And I'm just going to give you an example of it. If you go to thehumanaccount.com, is just one example of what we ran to really help people understand people's spending and saving behavior in a much more sophisticated way than rather than saying, a poor person does X and a less poor person does Y. And you can have a look. We've put all of our data up for public use, but banks are now using this to build the next generation of financial services products because we're disaggregating the consumer based on their new sets of behaviors. And then third one is around understanding true value. And I suspect I've got Manjula another 1 minute. Is that right?
Yes, that's fine.
Okay. Understanding true value to us, the people who will win the next decade are people who actually understand ROI in a true sense. I'll give one example that may be closer to home to this audience, right? Like Virunga National Park, such an important preserve in Africa. How much is it worth? I mean, this is an important conversation as we think about the effects of climate change, as we think about conservation, and it's a controversial subject, but it's one of the things that we had to undertake is actually to value it, to then convince people to preserve it. This is one of the programs that actually did work. They don't always work, but we, for example, were able to show that a national park is worth over $1 billion. We have not gotten into the habit of truly valuing social outcomes. And then the final thing I'll say is engage in the market for solutions. There's over $12 trillion of opportunity in addressing these goals that help us deal with climate change and many of our other goals sustainably. So a lot of our work then ends up being about helping clients think about what is the market opportunity as well, not just all of these dangers. So with that, I will stop and Manjula, hand it back to you, or if there's time for questions. But thank you for the time.